Now, delighted to say that Rob Harris from the Associated Press joins us to talk about the extraordinary news over the weekend. Manchester City banned from the Champions League for 2 years. The race for fifth is very much on. This is as part, obviously, of financial fair play, which was introduced in 2011. City have been found to have had serious breaches of financial fair play, to have been in serious breach of financial fair play rules between 2012 and 2016. So, Rob, one of the more damning points I've seen here, Der Spiegel got their hands on hacked emails effectively, and brilliant journalism from Der Spiegel, and they led the charge in this, and an investigation was launched subsequently. So one of the key charges put to Manchester City is that, for instance, Etihad were paying, there was a £67 million sponsorship of Manchester City, and it turned out that Etihad we're actually only paying 8 million of that. The other 57 million is courtesy of Sheikh Mansour and his company. In short, owners are not allowed to bail out the club like this.
Yeah, and effectively it's also disguising the true source of income as well. So not only just relying massively on sponsorship linked to the Abu Dhabi ownership, but also, as UEFA would see it, what we saw from what the leaks appear to show was a apparent attempt to circumvent the rules by disguising the source of income. And City have never disputed the authenticity of the documents. They do deny wrongdoing, but they've never actually gone through the specifics, in public at least, to tell us why these emails were being sent to suggest one part of a Sheikh Mansour business world was effectively, appeared to be at least, repaying elements of that sponsorship back to Etihad, obviously the main sponsor of the club.
And is this regarded as the most damning aspect of the investigation, Rob? This, say, 57 million of the 67 million Etihad sponsorship coming from Sheikh Mansour?
I mean, what we don't know from Friday's statement are the specifics that UEFA actually ultimately effectively found City guilty on. We just have this reference to the overstating of the revenue and of the break-even information. We obviously piece it back from the leaked internal correspondence, which has not been disputed by City, that also showed things like image rights deals, where they're selling off the image rights to a company with links, again, allegedly back to the ownership. So many elements ultimately to try to inflate the income in a way that was already under question, because they rely so much on sponsors from Abu Dhabi, where, of course, the ownership is from. These are obviously assessed for fair value by UEFA. They determine if it was a company unconnected to the ownership who wanted the naming rights or certain sponsorships. They assess, well, what would they actually pay? What is City worth on the open market? But ultimately, while City have previously had their case judged in 2014, and some of this does cover that period again, it's all about that new information that helped to shed a light, really, on what apparently were the dealings going on back in Abu Dhabi, funneling money around.
You mentioned 2014, Rob. So in 2014, UEFA determined that City had a deficit of €180 million over a 2-year period, which was vastly in excess of the €45 million permitted. So €180 million was their deficit. They're allowed €45 million. That is a hell of a deficit. The punishment in 2014 was a fine. So how have we gone from a fine, which frankly I'm sure Sheikh Mansour looked at and said, do your worst, how have we gone from that to a 2-year Champions League ban?
Yeah, and obviously we don't know, again, the full details, but it obviously points to the judicial side at UEFA really believing it's a serious breach, as they say in their statement, of the rules. And they mentioned things like the lack of cooperation from City. I mean, there was a sense I got at a time that they were basically not really answering the questions that UEFA investigators wanted answering. With the public position for so long was the fact we don't comment on this type of information that's being gained, the internal correspondence. So, yeah, this would point to something a lot more than just breaching the break-even and spending too much, but actually the conduct as well that was connected to that. So, I mean, it's obviously not unknown for teams to be banned from European competitions by UEFA for financial fair play, and contrary to the narrative that some would like to believe sometimes, that it's about the cartel keeping out the clubs trying to sort of break through. A lot of financial fair play is about making sure clubs are paying their debts, they're meeting their tax bills, they're paying the players. There's all these club licensing rules, even things like ensuring you have youth teams ultimately to ensure you can play in the Champions League. So yeah, it's a lot more than just about how much you can lose or how much you can spend. But yeah, I mean, what we will now get a lot more detail as this case heads to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, and ultimately at the end of it, we should see a lot more of the what led to the ban, if it survives at the end of the case as well.
Yeah, well, indeed. I'm sure there'll be some handsomely paid lawyers involved in this case. As I mentioned, financial fair play was introduced in 2011. I think a minority had high hopes for its scope. Is this Manchester City ban comparable with any other bans over the last 8 years?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, teams have been banned or various, ways that they don't participate. I mean, the AC Milan case from last year is obviously one of the bigger clubs as well. UEFA initially did ban Milan for 2 seasons from Europe. They appealed it, and effectively Milan accepted the 1-year ban, so they're out of the Europa League this season. Mm-hmm. That obviously also showed us how places are redistributed in Serie A to account for a team dropping out, because England should still get its 4 Champions League places, because they would only lose it in the case of a team that was eligible rejecting the chance to play in Europe.
I mentioned the 2014 incident. It's quite staggering that Manchester City didn't, after that fairly blunt warning, didn't clean up their act.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of this is about how the club acts, their conduct, the officials. And of course, many of the officials are still in place. They're officials who we see from internal correspondence were celebrating the death of one of the UEFA investigators. We're sort of basically saying they could, do what they liked with UEFA. They would spend millions on lawyers to put up against them. So this certainly showed City's belief that, they could take on the rules. But let's step back. You'll struggle to find anywhere a clear articulation from Manchester City with their views against financial fair play. So from the early days of the ownership that was before financial fair play was even officially introduced, to around the time that they first had to comply, to the time of the first sanctioning. There is no Manchester City public position saying this is what we think is wrong with FFP, this is what we think should change about it. It's just stuff that's sort of filtered out. And, you contrast that, say, to Liverpool, where, John Henry made very clear in his early days as the owner, one of the reasons they bought Liverpool was because of the existence of financial fair play. But never has there been a clear, detailed position against FFP, just sort of general criticism of processes that they're being judged by.
Yeah. You mentioned, by the way, that celebration of Jean-Luc Dehaene was the former Prime Minister of Belgium, who was a former chair of the IC, the investigative chamber. He passed away. He was survived by his wife and his 4 children, and Der Spiegel quoted one of the members of Manchester City's inner sanctum in an internal email saying 1 down, 6 to go of the IC. David Conn in The Guardian made the point, since that email's exposure, no one from City has apologised for the email, apparently due to the stance that the emails were hacked, so therefore the contents, however unfortunate, are not to be acknowledged. And that has been the Man City stance on all of this right the way through.
Yeah, right the way through. I mean, I actually even approached City before these leaks became publicly known in November 2018, because I had a leak about the leaks that were upcoming, and I actually put some of it to Gianni Infantino, who obviously was UEFA General Secretary back at the time of that 2014 settlement, now FIFA President, of course. And so I ran a piece actually a few days before Der Spiegel even published, which was Infantino talking generally about his own conduct, which I vaguely knew what the leaks might entail, nothing as detailed as eventually emerged. Manchester City probably hoped that all this might fade away, and their initial position was not commenting, but I think it just picked up steam, particularly as more and more information came out through November 2018, more of a sense of where the UEFA investigation would hold as well. So certainly public-wise, we've never heard any sort of strong defence. And of course, they can take a stance that this information was gained by means that they challenge, because of the person who is linked to it through Football Leaks is now awaiting trial in Portugal, not linked directly to the gaining of this information, but other information. But Football Leaks, as the bigger sensible. This has been used in cases in Spain. The criminal authorities there have used it to pursue cases. So, the evidence has been sufficient for them to use as a point to investigate from.
So they will appeal this. This will go to CAS. I mean, one of the points they've made is this is a UEFA investigation and they've been found guilty in the eyes of UEFA. This whole thing is prejudicial. They're going to go to CAS. Amongst the other tactics they will put forward in front of CAS in the summer is one that they don't believe the process has been fair. And if UEFA has slipped up in any procedural way, you can bet that the City lawyers will be all over that. And then also I saw that it's going to use the result of an investigation against PSG not so long ago, where the prosecutor there decided that actually the value of the PSG sponsorships was more or less at the value that PSG had declared. And that was despite an independent valuation suggesting that they were worth much less, which is, really tallies with the Man City situation in certain respects. Even I understand key figures, or I read key figures at UEFA were slightly alarmed by that decision. So I'm sure the Man City lawyers have looked at every available tactic here, and they'll be coming in a big way to CAS this summer. Is there any consensus yet as to how they may go at CAS, or is this thing do we not know enough at this stage?
Well, probably at this point I should declare where I'm sort of interlinked to this, which is the fact Manchester City have already been to CAS once to try to get the case thrown out and seeking damages, claiming faults in the process, in part largely over reporters gaining information to report from. So because I've reported elements of the investigation in the last year or so, that has been protested by Manchester City, questioning the how that information is discovered. So they've already tried to find fault in the process in that regard. Obviously, we find out information, we report it accurately and fairly. Then moving on, they will obviously go to the Court of Arbitration for Sport to again challenge who was judging them. And the prosecution side, the investigators at UEFA, are led by, it is an independent process. It does have independent figures like politicians, former Belgian Prime Minister at the head of it. They dispute a comment he made in the end of 2018 when he was talking generically about if there was a case, it would be something that had to be looked at, and not comment on the specifics. Ultimately, then the judicial side that decides on the ban is led by a European judge. So these are figures who you would assume to have high probity, and probably wouldn't necessarily like to read the fact that they're being effectively suggested to be part of a UEFA-determined investigation and verdict. So, it'd be interesting to see how that plays out. When it comes to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, you get arbitrators who decide on it, and both sides get to agree on effectively who is hearing the case.
Okay. As for matters on the field, Guardiola today said, I will still be here even if they put us in League Two. He's come out fighting in a big way, and he has said, he's going nowhere. The main players being talked about as potential flight risks include Raheem Sterling, who's also made a pledge of support, but the City, certainly until very recently, were looking for him to sign a £450,000 a week contract. De Bruyne at 29 years of age, and Laporte as well, City were looking to tie them down to 300 grand a week contracts. So those three seem to be the main flight risks, certainly in the eyes of the media. And again, over the weekend, there were reports that Juventus basically have an open invitation to Pep Guardiola. So as to what happens, Man City, the club, really this whole thing could crumble incredibly quickly, regardless, to be honest, of what Pep is saying today.
Yeah, I would separate from what we're hearing today with what happens, say, at the end of the appeals process. Yeah. I don't think you'd expect necessarily even briefings from the manager and player sides basically threatening to leave or to walk out while there's appeals ongoing, because anything would obviously undermine the club. Let's look at it when players know, manager know if they'll be out of the Champions League for 2, 1 or no seasons at all, ultimately end of the appeal process. And it'll be interesting if players do want to stick around, and it might depend on what age they're at, the status is, what their ambitions are, what they believe. Because, of course, City's spending will be affected after the ban if they do serve the 2-year ban, because they won't have had that hundreds of million of UEFA income potentially for 2 years, and the gate receipts and everything. So they'll have to comply with FFP when they emerge if they do so return a 2-year ban. So they need to be abiding by the break-even rules then. So it does have a consequence of missing out the Champions League money beyond the prestige and the reputational damage as well.
OK, Rob, listen, I know you're busy there. Thanks so much for making time for us. Appreciate it.
Have a good evening.